Imagine annoying a multinational company so much that somebody inside it decides you need to be taken down. Not sued, not rebutted, not ignored, taken down. And you're not CNN, you're not the New York Times or some giant media organization with lawyers on retainer. You're a married couple running a niche e-commerce blog from your home in Massachusetts. And on the other side is eBay, a multi-billion-dollar technology company with senior executives, corporate communications teams, investigations, and its own global security operation. That sounds like David versus Goliath, except in this version, Goliath allegedly starts sending insects to David's house. I read the news so that you don't have to. As you can see, the headline says, "Crush This Lady, How eBay Harassment Campaign Led to $56 million Payout." Now, lock in and stick with me because this is genuinely one of the craziest corporate scandals I've ever heard. It's basically one of those stories where every time you think, surely this must be the worst of it, it kind of gets worse. So let's start at the beginning. This is about Ina and David Steiner. So back in 1999, David sold some old camera equipment on eBay. And actually, the transaction for him went so well that the couple became these really enthusiastic users of the platform. And then they started a website called EcommerceBytes. Now, to be clear, this wasn't some gossip mag. This was trade journalism. So they covered things like fees, policies, seller complaints, changes to the platform. You know, the kind of boring but important stuff that actually affects people that make their living from eBay. And for years, eBay and the Steiners had what David described as a very professional relationship. They spoke to the press office, sometimes they argued, apparently sometimes they would even talk about baseball, you know, normal journalist company stuff. But as eBay increasingly shifted their focus towards larger retailers, EcommerceBytes became more critical. And crucially, underneath the articles were comments from eBay sellers who could be absolutely savage about the company. Now, we all know the maxim, right? You're supposed to just ignore the comments. Apparently, eBay execs just didn't get that memo. So senior people at eBay were reading them, and some of them were getting angry. Very angry. So in 2019, Ina wrote about the then CEO, Devin Venig's compensation. And according to records that later emerged, Venig messaged eBay's communication chief, Steve Weimer, words to the effect that it was time to take her down. And Weimer's own internal language was even more extraordinary. At one point he wrote, "We are going to crush this lady." And in another message, he said, "I want to see ashes, as long as it takes whatever it takes." Venig has always maintained that he didn't know that there was a harassment campaign that followed, and he was never criminally charged. Weimer and another senior executive, Wendy Jones, were also not criminally charged. But beneath them sat a man called Jim Bao. Now, Bao was eBay's senior director of safety and security, essentially the man heading the operation designed to protect eBay and its people. Well, instead of that, Bao and members of his team turned their attention to Ina and David. And this is where our story moves from dysfunctional corporate culture into complete madness. Act 1, break them. So it's August 2019 and the Steiners start receiving packages. First, the packages were strange, and then they became frightening. Think about how you would feel if you're married and some stranger sends you a book called Surviving the Death of Your Spouse. Then there was a funeral wreath, a bloody pig Halloween mask, and a preserved fetal pig. They even sent them live cockroaches and spiders. And at one point, they made a subscription to pornographic magazines in David's name and sent them out to neighbors. And that wasn't enough, because in the meantime, online, anonymous accounts were sending increasingly threatening messages. So clearly the objective was intimidation. Here's where I'm a little bit confused, because what did they think? Like they were going to make the Steiners so frightened that they would give up their livelihoods for some reason, or change what they wrote about eBay? I don't know, but this is perhaps the most absurd part of Act 1, because members of the security team devised this plan where they would create all this harassment, and then eBay security would offer to rescue the Steiners from it. I'm serious. That was their proposed strategy. Terrorize them anonymously, then appear like this helpful corporate security team that can make the terror stop. So the theory was that Ina and David would become so grateful to eBay that they would soften their coverage and maybe even help them identify the anonymous commenters who were upsetting the executives. I don't know about you, but to me, this is really giving this deranged version of like how to win back your ex vibes, right? So one thing you need to remember at this point is that the people being targeted, David and Ina, still have no idea that this was all coming from eBay. They just knew that somebody was obsessed with them. But then the operation moved offline. Act 2 is follow them. So members of eBay's security team traveled from California to Massachusetts. Now, if you don't live in the US, you may not know this, but that is more than 3,000 miles. And I'm pretty sure they didn't go there to attend MIT. For me, this is the point where you realize how many opportunities there were for somebody to say, what the fuck are we doing? Like, what's going on here? Flights had to be taken, hotels were arranged, cars were rented, expenses incurred. People had to physically leave eBay headquarters and travel across the United States because 2 bloggers had annoyed the company. That's crazy. So they start to surveil the Steiners' home and they follow David. And there were even plans apparently to install a GPS tracker on the couple's car. So Bao and another security executive, David Harville, even considered breaking into the Steiners' garage in order to attach the GPS tracker. And because someone apparently realized, like, oh, what if police ask why security executives from eBay are lurking around outside people's houses? They also carried documents suggesting that the Steiners themselves were being investigated as eBay persons of interest. Just sit with that inversion for a little bit. The people who were being harassed were being turned into suspects. Here's the thing, before their dastardly plan could unfold, something happened. And it's something that feels rather mundane in light of this big, dramatic campaign that was launched against them. The Steiners, they noticed they were being followed. And then this entire enormous corporate apparatus ran into something surprisingly small, the Nantic Police Department. So local police basically traced a rental vehicle, and that rental vehicle led them back to eBay. And then suddenly this company that had all the resources, all the technology, and all the security expertise had a very different problem. Someone was asking questions. And that brings us to Act 3, cover it up. So once investigators started getting close, members of the team started trying to create distance between eBay and what had happened. So digital evidence was deleted, false explanations were given, and documents were created to support alternative theories. At one point, there was an attempt to produce another fake person of interest file that could point police towards somebody else. And employees who had helped create the harassment were simultaneously presenting themselves as people assisting the investigation, which I feel like that's schoolboy era 101, right? If you watch any police investigation, they will tell you that the suspect will often try to insert themselves into the investigation. Stay your bum butt at home. What are you doing? Anyway, eventually the charges would go beyond cyberstalking because of things like this. So there were also allegations involving witness tampering and obstruction, but ultimately the cover-up failed. 7 eBay employees pled guilty. Jim Bao, the security chief at the center of the operation, he received 57 months in federal prison. Harville received 2 years, and others received prison sentences, home confinement, or probation. And then the United States did something quite significant. It charged eBay itself. So in 2024, the company entered a deferred prosecution agreement covering 6 felony offenses, including stalking, witness tampering, and obstruction. eBay admitted to a detailed statement of facts and paid the maximum available criminal penalty of $3 million. It also agreed to an independent compliance monitor. eBay's own chief executive later called what happened to the Steiners wrong and reprehensible. But for Ina and David, the criminal case was not the end, because remember the imbalance we started with? These were 2 people. eBay was eBay. So they sued the company and former senior executives. And for years, they refused to disappear. And that is really important because most people facing something like this do not have the resources, health, or sheer bloody mindedness to fight corporations for 7 years. The Steiners did. The civil litigation gave them access to tens of thousands of documents and allowed them to explore the corporate environment surrounding the security team. And then in July 2026, the case finally ended. eBay and 3 former senior executives agreed to a settlement worth $55.7 million. The Steiners will receive $48.7 million in compensation, and eBay is paying $46.15 million of that. Former CEO Devin Venig is paying another $2 million personally and donating $1 million to a First Amendment charity in Ina's name. Former operations executive Wendy Jones is paying $500,000, and Steve Weimer, the executive behind some of those extraordinary internal messages, is paying $50,000. Again, none of the 3 senior executives were criminally charged, and Venig has consistently said that he did not know about the harassment operation. So to be clear, the settlement resolves the civil case, but it's not criminal finding against them. But the settlement also contains something that is very important. There's no gag. So the Steiners can talk about what happened. They've published their own account and they've participated in a documentary. And after spending years being targeted because somebody wanted them to stop reporting, they get to keep reporting. And that's why the David and Goliath description works so well, because David didn't beat Goliath by becoming stronger than him. David survived long enough for Goliath's size to become part of the problem, part of the evidence, the corporate messages, the security operation, the travel, the surveillance, the employees' attempted cover-up, the extraordinary amount of machinery that could be mobilized against two people working from their home. And this is where I think the story becomes much bigger than eBay, because when we talk about threats to journalism, we normally picture governments or police kicking down doors or politicians censoring newspapers, reporters being arrested. But enormous corporations possess their own forms of power. Security team, investigators, lawyers, communications departments, data, money, access to information about ordinary people that those people could never obtain about the company. And what this case shows is what can happen when people inside an institution begin to believe that criticism is not something to answer, but something to eliminate. And let's face it, that process rarely begins in a boardroom with everyone coming together and saying, oh, well, let's commit a felony today. It begins with culture. A journalist becomes that woman, then the problem, then the enemy. Someone senior says, take her down, and then somebody else says, crush her. And then somebody further down the organization decides to demonstrate just how committed they are to solving the problem. And every escalation makes the next escalation slightly easier, until eventually a corporate security team is standing outside a blogger's house trying to put a tracking device on her car. And so the lesson here isn't simply 7 employees went rogue. eBay itself has acknowledged serious misconduct and has since changed leadership, policies, procedures, and controls. But the much more interesting question is, what kind of environment allows something this insane to begin feeling normal to the people participating in it? Because yes, eventually Ina and David won, but listen to what winning actually required. Years of fear, police, the FBI, federal criminal prosecution, prison sentences, a corporate prosecution, 7 years of civil litigation, and finally, $55.7 million. The Steiners have said that the experience left them with nightmares, insomnia, and hypervigilance. So when we say that David beat Goliath, perhaps we should remember the less comforting part of that story. David only wins if he survives stone throwing long enough to get his day in court. And I keep coming back to one question. Ina and David had evidence. They had each other. They had the police take them seriously. And they eventually had federal investigators and lawyers. How many people get crushed by Goliath when nobody's watching?